note that in Masechta Shabbos.
We begin the current Daf, Mesechta Megillah Daf Ches. Begin 8 lines down the top of the Yomit. We're in the middle of a discussion regarding the Seder of the Tefillah. We spoke about in the previous Mishnah that Megillah has to be Nikras al Seder, that can't be read Lemafreya out of order. And we said Chen Hal, we said Kriyishma, we said Tefillah, and we were discussing this interesting Gemara about the Seder Tefillah we daven every single day, about the specific order that was organized to be in that way. Some of this discussed in today's daf are you can't go start saying more praises in Shemoneh Esrei about Hashem because that's actually diminishing Hashem's honor. Kris Megillah, various halachas regarding the reading of Megillah, including al peh, reading it by heart, Chaloshin, another language, Seirugin, which is piecemeal, by starting and stopping, Seirusin, which is out of order, Misnam, as he's nodding off. If let's say the scribe left out some letters or psukim, but the one who's reading it read it by heart, or most of the letters were faded or torn, and ashud is al sefer b'dyon, that the Megillah has to be written in Lashon HaKodesh or parchment with black ink. And finally, also lichtav shalom leksav, the prohibition against writing stam, secretary tolam mezuzahs, by heart. So we begin the current daf Yudches, 8 lines down at the top of the Yomit. We're in the middle of the discussion. We're up to Maidim. We said, the last thing we said was Zevech Toidei Chabdanani. We said that after Zevech, after Ritzei, comes the bracha of Maidim. As we see Zevech, then comes Toidei. Now, what's after Maidim? So interestingly, it's not Sim Shalom or Shalom Rab, it's a Marolim and Birchas Koyanim. In the Shemoneh Esrei, and we even had at the end of Rosh Hashanah that essentially really our Shemoneh Esrei is only to give time for the shots to really prepare his Shemoneh Esrei. So the Shemoneh Esrei of the Shnei Tzibur, what comes after the Bracha of Maidim is actually Birchas Koyanim. So what do they see fit to say Birchas Koyanim Achar Haydah after the Bracha of Maidim? That's like it says in the pasuk in Megillah. It says V'yisa Anis Yoda V'lo'am V'yibachim. Aaron lifted up his hands to the people and he blessed them. And he came down from doing the sin offering and the burnt offering and the peace offering. So you see that Birchas Koyanim is by when you do the avodah. Says the Gemara, wait a second. If that's the case, then maybe say Birchas Koyanim Koyim avodah. It sounds like in the pasuk you just brought that Aaron lifted up his head, did Nasias Kapayim, and then he came down from doing the avodah of the karbanos. So Birchas Koyanim should be after. It should be before Ritzei, before the Avodah, not after Maidim. So it says, no, you can't entertain to say like you're asking, because the pasuk says, the pasuk says he didn't see his kapayim, and he came down from having done the chatas v'gayim etc. Miksav lasa says say to do, me'asois it says from having done it. So meaning he didn't see his kapayim, and he came down from having done the Avodah. It sounds like that the Avodah was before, and then Birchas Koyanim comes after. Says okay, then why don't you have Birchas Koyanim after Ritzei, before Maidim? Why do you do Ritzei, Maidim, then Birchas Koyanim? If it sounds like from the pasuk that it's related to the Avodah is the bracha of Ritzei. So say Ritzei, then say Birchas Koyanim, then say Maidim. Says you cannot entertain that. Like we said in the pasuk from the previous stuff on the top of the summit, Zevech Toida. We said that the pasuk says, one who slaughters a Thanksgiving offering, which we interpreted to mean to say, first comes the Zvicha, the carbon, then comes Toida, then comes the thanks. So thanks, like Rashi had explained, is really a chelik of the Avodah. So Ritzei and then Maidim. Says the Gemara, my chaz is samachahai. There's two concepts that we have over here. We have one concept of pasuk that says the Sis Kapayim is related to that of Avodah, and we have one pasuk that the Toida, the Maidim, is related to that of the Avodah. So why are you relying on that pasuk, not on this pasuk? Says yeah, but it's logical that the Avodah and the Maidim is one thing because, like Rashi explains here also, that also the Haidah is Avodah Shalak. So Maidim, giving thanks, this is the source of the Thank You Hashem movement. That it's Avodah. It's thanking Hashem of giving Haidah is the same thing as Avodah, and therefore it makes sense those go together, and then after that Avodah is going to come this of the Birchas Koyanim. Okay, says the Gemara, we're almost finished. What they see fit to have the bracha of peace after Birchas Koyanim. Because the pasuk in the middle, it says, "Somewhere Shemi al Bnei Yisrael." You should place my name on the Jewish people, which that's referring to Birchas Koyanim, and says Hashem, "I'm going to bless them." Oh, so wait a second. After Birchas Kohanim, Hashem's going to bless the Jewish people. And Baruch HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Shalom. So it never makes sense that Shalom comes after Birchas Kohanim. Where do we find that Hashem's blessing is peace? No, because it's a Pasuk in Tehillim. Hashem Yevarech es Amoy. Hashem blesses the people with what? Shalom, with peace. So therefore, we just concluded, we went through the whole Shemoneh Esrei showing you the order of why it is from Bracha of Magen Avos all the way through to Sim Shalom. Okay. Now says the Gemara, going back to something we mentioned in the previous Daf. If you told me there's 120 elders who may have a common navim, and you said some of them were even prophets, and therefore Reb Chaim Volozhin was very busy, and Reb Chaim saying every tefillah that you say is going to be a unique one. You'll never have that same Shemoneh Esrei ever again because it was made by the prophets, and every word is Terufim Kedoshim. That from that moment in history, you'll never. It was made mamash with Nevi'im, and even though it's the same words, don't think you're saying the same thing by rote. So if that's the way you said the Tiknu Tefillah, let's say they're the ones who organized this prayer, the order of the prayer. So we also mentioned on the previous stuff, the Shimon HaPekuli, that he also went. So my history, what did he organize, as we said, in front of Rabbi Gamliel? What do you need Shimon HaPekuli if you have from already previous generations, you have the Nevi'im that already organized Shemoneh Esrei? It says, the Gemara, they forgot it. And then he went along and he reorganized them. But you're right, it was originally composed by the Zekanim, with many of them being Nevi'im. Okay, now the Gemara says, but Mikama Elach, from this point onwards, after the Shemoneh Esrei was already composed by the Nevi'im, Asal Saper, it's forbidden for someone to say over, and Rashi says important words, in the establishment of Bracha, B'shivcha Shel Makom. Again, it's not saying that you can't have to thank Hashem movement. You're allowed to thank Hashem for missing the bus and thank Hashem for everything not working out. You can thank Hashem for everything. But you can't make it in a bracha. You can't start adding on more praise in Shemoneh Esrei. Because Amar Blaza says, "My, it wasn't in the pasuk in Tehillim. It says, Mi Yamal Gevuras Hashem, who is to say over the might of Hashem, Yashmiya Kol Teilasei, should say over all his praise. What does that mean? For whom is it appropriate to say over the might of Hashem? Someone that could go and let it be heard, all his praise. Now, there is no one who could say over Hashem's whole praise. So therefore it's not appropriate for ourselves to say over only what? The Chacham or Masakin. But to say more, that's not appropriate. If someone says over the praise of God more than what's appropriate, he gets uprooted from the world. Krishna says the pasuk in Eve. It says, "Hayisupa loy." If it's going to be said to him, meaning his entire praise, ki adaber, because I'm speaking, I'm increasing to Hashem the words of Shevach. Im amar ish, if a person is going to say that he's going to do such a thing, ki yavula, then he's going to get swallowed up. Because again, it's not appropriate to say when you don't even have the capacity to even understand and fathom the greatness of Hashem. Some say Ishkvar Gibur Chayil. Might this wasn't a pasuk in Tehillim L'cha Dumiyah Tila. To you, Hashem, silence is praise. So says the Gemara, yes, Sama the Kula, the portion of them all is mashtuka, is silence. Meaning, don't increase your words. And that's what L'cha Dumiyah Tila. Like we can't even start. Like what can we even say? So silence is the greatest praise because to say would be diminishment. When Rabdimi came, he said something similar. He said, they said in the West, famous phrase, Mila Besela, a word for a sela, and Mashtuka Betrein, and silence for two. Meaning if you want to purchase speech for one sela, and silence for two slam. Because silence is more valuable than speech, and we find that similar idea regarding the Shvach HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Going back to the halacha of the Mishnah, we said, okay, the first halacha we discussed, and we got into other different areas of halacha that have the same thing about not reading it l'mafreya. Now, another halacha regarding Megillah was if you read it by heart, you have not fulfilled your obligation, etc. So what do we know that the Megillah has to be read from a sefer, and it cannot be read by heart? So Amar Rabbi says, "As Yischir Yischir Gzeir Shavah." Ksevach has in the Megillah by Yomei Nizkarim that these should be remembered, which we said it's remembered by saying over the story, the Purim story, which is the Megillah. Now it says within Shemais, which actually is very much related when it talks about Amalek, which that's where Haman is from Amalek. He says, write this as a recollection in a sefer. Ooh, it says over there Zikar and says over here Zikar. Malar Masefer, just like it was in a scroll. I've come Masefer also, but here it has to be from a scroll. It says the Gemara, wait a second, I don't know if I understand clearly this limud. But my dahai zechira, from where do you know that this recalling by Amalek was kriyahi, that you have to read it? Maybe it's just to look into it, to analyze it. Maybe you just have to look into the Sefer. Many people read a book, you don't hear them reading it out loud. You just have to look at it. Who said, yeah, it has to be with a Sefer? Who said you have to read from the Sefer? So the Gemara you can't entertain to say like you're asking, because the pasuk says, Zoch, which is a famous pasuk, now, when it says to remember, you would think, okay, in your heart remember. When the pasuk says in the bottom, don't forget, okay, not forgetting is already talking about to remember in the heart, not to forget from the heart. So remembering, remember, that must mean prepare with the mouth, and it says Basefer, so that's how I know you have to say it with your word from a Sefer, and that's how I know that the Megillah cannot be read by heart, it has to be read from a Sefer. Moreover, the Megillah, the Mishnah continues, it says Targum. If you read the Megillah in the Aramaic translation, you have not fulfilled the obligation, etc. It says, what is the case talking about? If it's written in Lashon HaKodesh, like we have our Megillahs, the Kodel Targum, but the one who's reading it is translating in Aramaic, well, hang on, pet. That's essentially reading it by heart, because you're not reading the Aramaic words in that scroll. You're translating when you say, and it was in the days of Achashverosh, and you're saying in Aramaic. So yeah, because you know how to translate Hebrew very well, but that's essentially reading it by heart. So no, you're right. It's necessary. We're talking about the Chesiva Targum, or Karla Targum. We're talking about what's written in Aramaic. Ismail, whatever the Aramaic words are, it's like a Targum, and he read a Targum. So that's the Chiddush we're saying that wouldn't be by heart, and still you're not Yitzhak because it can't be read with Targum. Now the Mishnah continues, says, but you could read it for certain people that speak in a certain language. You could read the Megillah in that language for them, etc. Says, well, I don't understand. You just contradicted yourself. But you just said in the previous line, if you read the Megillah in any other language, lo yotza, you not fulfilled your obligation. And now you tell me, for French, you can read it in French. For the English, you can read it in English. So, says the Gemara, Rabbi Shloimy Schwartzberg, they both say that we're talking about specifically Balaz Yavani. When we said that you could read in a different language for those people who speak the language, we're talking about specifically in the foreign language of Greek. Greek is the exception to the rule. You cannot read the book of Lashon, but if you have some Greek individuals and you're reading it in Greek for them, so then you would be Yitzhak. And before we get back to this, the Gemara just brings another teaching from Ba'amar Bacham and Balaza, who we just quoted. He's the one who just said that it was written in. So it says the Gemara. No, I skipped a line. So the Gemara says, "Hey Chidami." The Gemara says, "What's this talking about?" If it's talking about where it was written in Ashuri script, like we have our Hebrew letters, but the guy's reading it in Greek, that would be the same problem about reading it by heart. It says Gemara, no, it's written in the Greek lettering, and he's reading in the Greek language, and that's what we're saying, that's going to be loyas as balaz, you'd be yitzin. As we mentioned, as we'll explore shortly, that Greek is different. But first, the Gemara brings another teaching from the same Ba'amar Ba'acha, Amar Balasa. It says, "Menayin shekara Kadosh Baruch Hu Yaakov El." Where do we find that Hashem calls Yaakovinu Kel, which is like a term of like a god, but it also means mighty. So, Shenem, like it says in the pasuk. Pasuk says that Yaakov made a mizbeach, but it says v'yatzav shem mizbeach. It says v'yikru loi, and he called it or him Kel Elokei Yisrael. Now, the way the Gemara is reading it is v'yikru loi is Hashem. Hashem called to him Kel, and who called him that was Elokei Yisrael, as the Gemara explains. These are good because if you would think to say that Lemizbeach Korle Yaakov Kel, that it's as a simple understanding of the pasuk would seem to be, that it says there in the beginning of the pasuk, V'yatav Shem Mizbeach, he made a Mizbeach, V'yikol Loy, and it would sound like it's going to Yaakov. He's the subject of the pasuk. He called the Mizbeach Kel Elikei Yisrael. But if that's the case, says the Gemara, then it should have V'yikol Loy Yaakov Miparle. What it should have said is not V'yikol Loy stop. It should have V'yikol Loy Yaakov. It doesn't say that. It says V'yikol Loy. Ella rather says the Gemara, v'yikra loy liYaakov kel. Almost like as if it said the word liYaakov over there. That he called Yaakov kel, or Mikra kel, and the pasuk is explained. And who called him kel? Was Elikeyos or Zakala Jewish people? Now Taisa says, really, you do find other psukim. Like v'yikra Shema Hashem Nisi, v'yikra Hashem Shalom. We do find other psukim that it says the same type of words, and we don't say it's like Hashem called him. We find that they were calling this to the Mizbeach. But it says Taisa, yeah, at least in those psukim, there is some type of miracle, there's some type of event that it would make sense why he's calling him Mizbeach like that. But here we don't find any action to say that why Yaakov had called him Mizbeach Kel. And if it was that he was calling it Kel, it should have been more explicit. For the fact that it wasn't, that's how Rabbi Acha knows that actually Hashem is calling Yaakov Avinu Kel. But Yikuloi, he called him Kel, and who was that who called him Kel? Was Elikei Yisrael. Hashem called Yaakov Avinu Kel. Okay, but that was parenthetical. That was just because we had the same lawyers who recorded this teaching. But we're going back. Meisvei. The Gemara goes back to ask on Rabbi Shmuel. That Rabbi Shmuel said that when they said in the Mishnah, when you read out L'loyaz is balaz, even though I said b'cholashi not yaitza, then I suddenly tell you if whatever language they speak and you read the Megillah in that language will be yaitza. They ask from the following brayso that seems to indicate that no, that even Greek you're not yaitza. What does the brayso say? The brayso says karo giftis. If you read the Megillah in this language of giftis or ivris or elamis or modis or yavanis, lo yatza, not for the obligation. So that contradicts what Rabbi Shmuel said to explain our Mishnah. They said that if you read the Megillah in Greek, you're going to be yaitza, and we see that. Says the Gemara, no. The teaching of Rabbi Shmuel, lo yidami elaha. Don't compare it to this brayso. Compare it to a different brayso. The brayso says, giftis legiftim. If you read the language of giftis to people that are from giftim, and that's essentially what our Mishnah is also saying. We said l'loy azois laz. You're reading for that language for those type of people. Or ivris le'ivrim. Ivris is the lashon of Eber Hanar, of the over the river, the other side of the river. Or ilmis le'ilmim, or yavanis le'yavana. Yotza, you've fulfilled your obligation. So you see the brayso is like Rabbi Shmuel, that for the Greek, if you read to them in Greek, then you can be yaitza. But then the Gemara says, wait a second, if that's the case, Rabbi Shmuel, l'mayim mukmi lo l'masnitin. Why did they explain that when our Mishnah says you read it balaz, loloiz was balaz, was balaz, yavanis was specifically a foreign language of Greek, look mebachalas, based on the brayso you just brought, it's every foreign language. It's giftis legiftim, it's ilmis leilmim, it's modis lemod. Every person, French, Chinese, wherever they're from, if you read in their language, you're yaitza. So why are they saying specifically if it's laz yavani? Says, well, you're right. You're right. Ella, but rather, masnitin kibraisa. Our Mishnah is like this brayso that we just brought. Meaning, when our Mishnah said, if you karabach halashon, if you read in every language, you're not yaitza. Was, for example, if you're reading giftis for someone from Madai, or you're reading Madas for someone from Giftim. But if you read out Laloiz's balaz, everyone according to his language, yeah, you can be yaitza. And that's what the Mishnah says. So it's not a contradiction. Karabach halashon, not yaitza, but then Laloiz's balaz would be yaitza, because yes, if you hear the Megillah you're in Paris and you hear it in French, then you're not going to be yaitza because you're not yaitza b'chalashon. But if Lalois is balaz, then you would be yaitza. So then wait a second. So Rabbi Shmuel. So when we said this teaching Rabbi Shmuel that they said specifically it's laz yavani, that was ba'alma, but that was said in a different context. Rabbi Shmuel, Damit Avei, they both say the laz yavani lachol kosher. Why they were picking specifically the foreign language of Greek was for everyone. Even a Chinese, even a Frenchman, whatever it is, if they hear the Megillah in Greek, that's going to be yaitza. That's the exception to the rule. And therefore that's what they were saying. But nothing to do to halacha of the Mishnah. It says the Gemara, but we seemingly learned not like this, because the Brayso says Yavanis li'Yavanim. We quoted before, giftis le'giftim, and we said modas le'mod. And one of them was, if you read Yavanis to Yavanim. That sounds like in, yes, if you read Greek for a Greek. But for everyone else, someone from Indonesia would not be yaitza with Greek. Says the Gemara, you're right, that Brayso is not like Rabbi Shmuel. But in the Dhamma Rabbi Shmuel, but they say like Rabbi Shmuel. Now we learned the Mishnah previous of Chesem Abayis. Shmuel he disagreed with the Tanakhama. He says Av Svarim Lo Hitir. He says no, it's not true like Tanakhama that you can write a Sefer Torah in any language you want. No, you'll have to write in Hebrew. The only exception was Sheikhtu El Yavanis, that you can write it in Greek. So like Rabbi Shmuel is who they're holding like that. They're saying The one exception that you could have Megillah read for, if it's written in Greek and you read in Greek, that for everyone is only Greek, not like the previous brisa, rather like Rabbi Shloimy. So it's like, okay, if that's who they're going like, so why don't they just say halacha Rabbi Shloimy? They have to say that Yitzu with Laz Yavani, just say halacha Rabbi Shloimy, and we know that he holds that's the same thing as Lashon HaKodesh. Says the Gemara, no. Had they said halacha Rabbi Shloimy, I would have said, I would have said by Sefer Torah, Nevi'im, Ksuvim, of Megillah, but by the Megillah, I would have thought maybe not. Why? Because it says in the pasuk Kiksavam as they're writing, which Imolai was said it's not valid in Greek because it has to be specifically in their Hebrew writing. That's what Rabbi Shmuel coming to tell us that no, Rabbi Shmuel would apply even by the Megillah, like a Sefer Torah, and therefore Belaz Yavani, everyone is Yaitza, not just Yavanim. And how, but like our Mishnah said, giftus legiftim, everyone in their own language is valid. And b'chaloshin that we said you're not Yaitz when you read it for some other language, for some other culture, that's where you're not going to be Yaitz. Now we said in the Mishnah, v'aloyes sheshama ashudis. Now, if someone speaks some other language, but if he hears the Megillah in Hebrew like we do it, so yatsa v'chul has fulfilled obligation, etc. So if you have someone who doesn't know Hebrew, recently a minted person to the culture of the Jewish tradition, and he comes and he hears the Megillah, he doesn't know a word of Hebrew, he's going to be Yaitza the Chiv of Megillah. Says, he doesn't know what they're saying. How could it be Yaitza, the Parsumi Nisa, which is Lasos as the Meha Purim Ba'ela, but he has no clue what they're even saying. They only know they're reading Eicha. Just maybe the tune would be different, but he doesn't know what they're saying. Says, it's the same thing like you have by women and ignoramus. That even though they don't know what they're saying, the Yaitza. Why? Because there's a mitzvah of Kriyam, Persumi Nisa. So even though they don't have a clue, they come in, they're just like, there, they're Yaitza. That's the same thing you'll have with this person who doesn't know the Hebrew language. But Ravina asks, he says, what are you even talking about? He says, Atu Anan, do you think us, you think we know what does it mean, no one even knows how to translate those words. So there's no kriya. And rather, mitzvah kriya persumi nisa, rather, must be, there's a mitzvah to read, and persumi nisa just to publicize it. So chanam and mitzvah kriya persumi nisa here also, again, it's just a mitzvah to read and to publicize the miracle, like Rashi explains. He says, even though we also don't know what we're hearing, but we ask, and people say, oh, what are we reading? What was the miracle? And we let people know, so it's not like you have to know exactly everything that you're hearing. It's about the whole event. It's the Avirah. You come there and you say, oh, Aman, what happened? I'm saying people are dressed up. And so even though the guy doesn't know the words in the Megillah, he's going to be Yaitza, because we also don't know every word in the Megillah either. Said in the Mishnah, that Kada Sirugin. If you read the Megillah Sirugin, Yatza, you feel the obligation of Chulu. So it says the Gemara, and we have this Gemara elsewhere in Shas, the rabbis, meaning the students of Rabbeinu HaKadosh, of Yehuda Nasi, they didn't know my Sirugin. The Rebbe said something in Shir, and everyone's afraid tzitzering, you don't ask the Rebbe what he meant. Baruch Ber, you have a Simonim and Bir Shmuel, like, what did the Rebbe say? He's not going to ask him, he's going to make 7 Simonim on what did the Rebbe mean. So they didn't know what does it mean when the Rebbe said Sirugin, you're going to be Yitzhak, they didn't know what it meant. Shamuel Amsu the Rebbe, but they heard the maidservant in the household of Rebbe, the Amrlu the Rabbanon. She told the rabbis, Aili Piski they were coming in shifts to the house of Rebbe. She told them, how long is it going to be that you're going to be coming in shifts? Oh, so they knew that Sirugin means with pauses, meaning shifts. So when we said in the Mishnah that Kodesh Sirugin, you're going to be Yaitza, but the Mishnah says, let's say you read and then you pause for an hour and then you continue reading, that you're going to be Yaitza even though you're pausing. So to Labiyadi Rabbanan, my Chalaglogus. The rabbis didn't know what Chalaglogus is. It's a type of herb, which is mentioned many times in the Mishnayos and the Braisos, and they didn't know what it was. So Shmuel Amsa the Beit Rebbe, so they heard the maidservant of the household of Rebbe, the Amr Leila Hu Gavra, that she was telling a certain person, Avakumavader Parpachini, that he was scattering his purslane, which is a type of a herb. She was telling him about Mosat Mafaza Chalaglogocha, until how long are you going to scatter your Chalaglogoch? So they realized that what is Chalaglogoch is purslane, because they knew what Parpachini is. The rabbis didn't know how to translate a pasuk in Mishlei. So Saleha turned it around. Usurem Mecca, and it will exalt you, it will elevate you. So they didn't know what salsaleho meant. So Shabul Amsud the Rebbe, they overheard the maidservant of the house of the Rebbe, the Habas Amra Allahu Gabash, he was telling a certain person that Mahapach B'mazi, he was turning around his hair. Maybe if he's Litvish, it was the front of his head, maybe it's Hasidish, it was the side of his head, but it was turning and turning and turning and turning around his hair. So Amalei, they said to him, so she said to him, how long are you going to be turning around your hair? Which we learned that the word silsul is like seeking and turning around and turning around and turning around, like hafuchba, ba'afuchba, the kula base. So that's the mean silsuleho. Turn it around to a Mecca, and then the Torah that will elevate you. So they realized that that's where the word misalsa means, because this guy was turning and turning and turning his hair, and she said that word misalsa. The rabbis didn't know what does it mean the pasuk in Tehillim? Hashlach al Hashem yahavcha. Throw on Hashem your yahav. They didn't know what that means. What's your yahav that you should throw on Hashem? So Amar Rabbi B'chad, he says Zimna Chada. One time one time I was with an Arab merchant, because they didn't know that I was carrying a load. He said to me, Shekol yahavayach. Take your load, and throw it on my camel. So he realized that yahav is a load. And so it says, Hashlach Hashem yavecha, throw on Hashem your load, and he will take care of you. The rabbis didn't know what does it mean the pasuk in Yeshaya that says V'teitesiha b'metate hashmi. I'm going to be metata with a metata of destruction. They didn't know what does it mean that bubble is going to be destroyed with metata. They didn't know what that meant. So Shemula answered the Rebbe. They overheard the maidservant of the house of the Rebbe. She was telling a friend, Shekayli tatesa, take a broom, bitati besa, and sweep the house. So they realized that metata meant like sweeping, that the bubble is going to be swept with a broom of destruction. Now, Torah in the Brisa, going back to this halacha that we mentioned in the Mishnah, Karas Seidugim. If you read the Megillah discontinuously, meaning like we said, with gaps, with shifts, as they realized what the word meant from the Amsad Beirevi. So like we said, Yatza, he has fulfilled his obligation. But Seidusin, which was the first halacha we said in the Mishnah from the previous Daf, which means Lemafreya. Why? Because like we find Sodas is a mikra b'dershe. We find many times like we say, okay, cut up the pasuk and make what's in the beginning later, what's later in the beginning, which is out of order, or like Yatza B'chutach and Masudis, which is like inverted. So if you read Megillah out of order, backwards, then you have not fulfilled the obligation. He says, actually, even though we said that if you read the Megillah with gaps, you can be yaitze, but he qualifies this and he limits this teaching. He says, if the person delayed to finish the whole Megillah in that amount of time, then you got to go back to the beginning. And he says, Allah is like that. That if you waited when you're middle reading Megillah, waiting for quiet, and no one's becoming quiet, and you wait the amount of time that you can finish the whole Megillah, you got to go back to the beginning. Now, the Gemara actually asks on this teaching, it says, when you're saying that the amount of time it takes to finish the whole thing, let's say that's from where he's holding till the end, where you could have finished it, and let's say you were towards the end of the Megillah and the kids are getting rowdy and you're just, okay, we're going to wait for quiet, we're not going anywhere, then you could have finished it, then you got to go back to the beginning. But maybe it means, no, you could have finished it had you started from beginning to end. That gap is how long you would have to wait. So Malay said, he said Merish Sefer. It means the amount of time you could have finished it had you started all the way to the end. Because if you think it would mean where you're up to, then what's called Nasata de Berechel shiur, and the Gemara generally doesn't like that you're making your words dependent on measurements, which means to say no one's going to know how long that amount of time is, because when we say Kedei Achilles Pras, so we know it's machlik is exactly, but at least we can know how much we're talking about. But if let's say it's subjective, so no one knows how to be able to qualify that, like okay, so we're towards the end, so now it's how many minutes is considered hefsek? But if it's from the beginning to the end, we know that it's a certain amount of time. It's not subjective to shiurim, to different people and different situations, and therefore it must be, if you waited the amount of time you could have said the whole Megillah, then you would have to start all over again. Now, he says, halacha is, again, like we said, like this teaching of Rabun. Ushmolam, he says, no, in halacha is not like Rabun. Which, again, Rabun said that this heter of Seidugin is limited. So Shmuel says halacha is not like it. It's not limited. So, I don't care how long you wait. You don't have to start over. Now, says in Surah, which was a place in Babel, they taught the discussion as we just said it right now about who says what. But Pumbedisa, actually it was not a band, it actually was a place in Babel. They actually taught that different teachings, different names. Amar Rav Kahana Amar Rav. It's actually Rav Kahana named Rav. Halach Gramuna. He says Halach is a Gramuna. Again, who does limit it. Shmuel he says in Halach Gramuna. Halach is not Gramuna. So the difference is that it was Rav Kahana Amar Rav. And Rabbi Masni Ipcha, he taught the opposite. He says no, Rav Amar in Halach Gramuna. Rav is the one who says Halach is not Gramuna. Shmuel Amar, and Shmuel says Halach Gramuna. Halach is like Gramuna. And then Rabbi Yosef, he finishes off by saying, you should hold on to the version of Rabbi in your hand, meaning that he had said, that Shmuel said, halacha is like Reb Muna, and therefore one would have to start over if you waited that amount of time, which but actually Tosfos says that he quotes. That means Rav said halacha is not like Emunah, and therefore it says that's actually the halacha that you would have to go back, that you don't have to go back to the beginning, because halacha is like Rav by Isuri, and the Birchon also is like him, and then Tosfos actually says that, like say someone saying waiting by emes v'yatzid, amount of time that he could have said the whole thing doesn't make a difference. We don't paskin that you would have to go back to the beginning even though you waited such a long time. Now, how do we know that Shmuel is the one who's in the halacha is a Gemuna, and therefore, again, Rav, like Tosfos says, is not a Gemuna, and therefore that's what Tosfos wants to say halacha is not a Gemuna, and it's not limited. But the reason is because the reason why we should say like Rabbi Yosef, like Rabbi Bibi's version, because the Shmuel who dechayish lichidah, we find this idea that Shmuel is concerned for a minority opinion, where that minority opinion is stringent, which like that's the case over here. The stringent opinion is that of Reb Muna, who he says that if you waited an amount of time that you could have said the whole thing in not Yaitza, but really the majority disagreed with Reb Muna. So again, that version makes sense, that it was Shmuel who was saying like him, like Reb Muna. Why? Where do we find that Shmuel is concerned for a minority opinion? It's not like Mishnah says Yavam. Mishnah says Shemeres Yavam. The word Shemeres means anticipating, waiting, where someone's waiting for his Yavam. Now, they mean to say that one of the brothers died without any children. Now, there is a mitzvah that the oldest brother should be Hebrew. Now, what happens if, let's say, Shekidish Achem as Achesa, one of the brothers actually came along and got engaged to the sister of their sister-in-law, meaning their sister-in-law is now a Yavam. And she really fell for Yibum because their brother died without any children. And one of the brothers went and got engaged to the sister, which Tosfos explains that we're talking about specifically where he got engaged. Then we say, okay, don't get married, because since she's only engaged, it would still look like he would be marrying a chesed kukasa. But if let's say he married her, she's totally his wife, he wouldn't have to wait at all, because that means the zika was removed. And it's also only specifically if he got engaged to her after what's called the nefila, after their brother died. But if let's say he was engaged to her, to the sister-in-law's sister, before their brother died, then he would have no problem about getting married, because there was no zika at all. There was no connection, because he was already engaged to the sister. Obviously, he cannot go ahead and marry the sister-in-law, who their brother's wife, who died without any children. So specifically that he got engaged to the sister after she was already Shemeres Yavam. So Meshumar Yehudim B'Seir Amon, the name of Yehudim B'Seir, they said, we tell that brother, stop, wait, don't get married yet to the sister-in-law's sister. Until the oldest brother does this action in the Yavama, either of Chalitza or of Yibum. But as long as the Yavama is in front of all of them to do either Chalitza or Yibum, so every single one of the brothers, this sister-in-law is like his wife, through what's called the Zika, which we'll have fun when we get to Yavama, it's about Zika, and it's the connection of Yibum, which therefore he's forbidden to her sister, because it's like it's Achis Ishtai. Because, and this is the point of this Mad Amar, which is a stringent minority, that he holds there is Zika, there's like a connection, even if there's two brothers, which is a chiddush, because obviously she's not married to me and to you and to you and to you. All the brothers cannot be having a Zika and say she's our wife, because if there's one brother, I could understand. I could say, okay, you're the only brother, so there could be a Zika bond. This Mandama holds no, that even when there's two brothers, for sure by one, there's going to be like a zika, almost like as if she's your wife, and therefore the sister that you're engaged to, you can't marry her because it's like a chaysishta. Now, the Rabbanan disagree with this opinion. They say that no, since they're two brothers, so the zika is not distinct to be on any one of them to be like his wife, and therefore actually they hold that younger brother who got engaged to that sister-in-law's sister is actually permitted to go ahead. He doesn't have a zika. Zika is only when there's one brother. On that, Shmuel, and Shmuel said in that Mishnah in Yavam, is that halacha say that he's the minority stringent opinion. Then no, we tell him don't go ahead and marry her yet. So you see that Shmuel is chayshish l'das yichida, and therefore it makes sense like this version of Rabibi that he quoted that Shmuel was the stringent interpretation, saying halacha is like Ramuna, who said he limits that of Serugin, that if you waited the amount of time you could have said Menashe B'Seifa, then you're not going to be Yaitza. Because we see that Shmuel is the one who's Chayshel Das Yach. Now tell them, when the Brayse K'tir on these halachas, related to these of our Mishnah, Hishmat Ba'as Seifa, let's say the Seifer, the scribe, left out Oisiyes Oy Psukim. Maybe he was writing it on Purim itself. He left out certain letters or Psukim. Now, the one who was reading, he's middle reading Megillah, he sees his letters and his words, but the Baal Kairi, he knows, and he reads it like the way the translator does, which he does it by heart. And he makes up for those words by heart. Yotzes with one obligation. So Gemara says, how can you say that? Meser learned the Brayse that says, he says, mitushtashes. Let's say even if there was just smudged letters, or torn. So the Brayse says, if the remnants of that where it's torn or smudged is recognizable, so sure, that's going to be kosher. Then labad and psul is going to be invalid. So if even smudged that you can't read is going to be invalid, how can you tell me if they cipher left out certain letters or even verses, then you can be yaitze? So it's not difficult because this that we said it's going to be puzzle is bekula. Only if it's the majority, so to speak, which is the whole. If all of the Megillah is smudged, then we're saying you're not going to be Yaitza, or if it's torn. But if it's recognizable that Hashim is there, then yeah. But when we said that if you're missing letters or psukim, you can be Yaitza, there's only some of them. Some of them is okay if it's just missing, and the Balkai reads it by heart. The Talmud when the Brayso, related to this idea of our Mishnah, which was the opening halacha of the Mafreya, of what we call Sirusin, or Mafreya, they're not going to be Yaitza. So the Brayso says, Hishmet b'hakoy pasuk echad. Let's say, in the middle of reading the Megillah, he didn't have his finger on the line, and he skipped the pasuk. And then he realizes, he's like a few lines later, like, I realized I missed the line. So it says the Brayse Loyim, he shouldn't say, okay, you know what, Ekra is kula. Let me first finish reading the Megillah. And then I'll read that pasuk that I missed. No. You have to go back and read from that pasuk onward. Like we said, because L'mafrei, you're not Yaitzu. Let's say someone comes to the shul. And he was busy with the customs, whatever, the ladies, the men, whatever it is. He comes in, they're already halfway through the Megillah. Lo Yomi shouldn't say, okay, look, let me get the second half with the tzibur. Then I'll make up the first half. No. You have to read the Megillah from the beginning until the end and go ahead and read it yourself because you can't go backwards. You can't do the second half and then do the first half. Said in the Mishnah, Misnamim. Let's say you're reading the Megillah dozing off. You stayed up late. The first night had a big party, and you're like half there, half not there. You come in and you're reading the Megillah half dozing off. Yotza, you're yotza yichi b'chul etc. Now, again, this is talking about the guy who's reading it. The halacha might be different from one who's listening, and that might not be qualifying. But it says, what does it mean dozing off? What is this dozing that you're saying you're yotza? Some of Rashi says this. We're talking about nim b'lei nim. The guy's sleeping but not sleeping. Tir b'lei tir. He's awake but not awake. What does that mean? The koder leva ani. They'll call him and he'll answer. Right. So he's like he'll answer, but he won't know how to say something intelligent, like something like that'll be able to think of because his brain's not really there. That's like called dozing off. But when you remind of something, he says, "Did you take out the?" Oh yeah. So that's like Friday night, whatever, on the couch. Maybe is a good hagdara, or because in Misnamnim, if you read the Megillah in that state, you can be yaitza. Now the Mishnah said, if the person was writing the Megillah, or Dorsha was expounding it, or Magia, or he was editing it, so if he focused his heart when he was doing this, that he's reading it for the purposes of his chiyuv of the Megillah, then yatzeh fil obligation b'chulu, etc. But if not, then not. So there are some Gemaras add on words over here and say that Bishlam and Dorsha Megillah. Understand if you're expounding the Megillah or you're editing the Megillah, where the words they say is Doksiva Kula amongst the Kameh. It's all written and it's laying there in front of him. You understand how if he's having in mind when he's doing that to be Yitzis Chiv, how can be Yitzis? But Elakaisva, and that's where the Gemara starts. Elakaisva Hechadami. But if he's writing the Megillah, what's the case talking about? Either Komisar the Psuka Psuka, if we're talking about where he's organizing orally the pasuk, he's saying Vayihi b'mei Achashverosh, Hu Achashverosh. He's saying the pasuk b'kasla and he's writing it down. So Kikivan Liba Mayhava, what does it help that he's having in mind? But Alpehu, he's doing this by heart. So the brother says, no, we're talking about the chasam psuka psuka b'kasla. First he's writing it, he writes the pasuk, and then he says it afterwards. Vayihi b'mei Achashverosh, Hu Achashverosh. Okay. Says Miyatz, you think a person would be Yitzis Chiv of Kriyas Megillah if he's writing the Megillah and then saying, even reading it from the parchment, which is not al peh? But he says halacha kedivra omer kula. The halacha is like, we'll see this in the later Mishnah, that the halacha is that you have to read the whole entire Megillah, and which the machlik is in the Mishnah later on. Where does the person have to read from the Megillah to be Yitzis Chiv? He says the whole thing. He says from Ishihudi. Okay, but then he says something which are very important. He says and even according to the one that says Ishihudi, that it's enough if you read from Ishihudi. But it's still, all of it has to be written in front of you. So although you don't have to read from it, but it has to be called a Megillah, and only if all of it is written are you Yitzis. So how could we say that the guy is writing a Megillah, and even if he wrote it and then he says the verse that he's Yitzis, but it wasn't all written in front of him, to say that he's reading from a Megillah? Because the Megillah is only when the whole thing is written. Rather says the Gemara, no. The case of our Mishnah must be talking about the month of Megillah Kameh. There actually is a Megillah laying in front of him, and he's copying from that Megillah. And he's reading every pasuk as he's copying. So he's reading, and he reads the pasuk, and then he goes and he writes it down in this new Megillah that he's writing. And he goes back, and he reads the next verse, and he writes it down. So even though he's doing it as he's writing, if he's having in mind, because sometimes they do it just to make sure I got the words right, okay, but and he writes it down. But if he's having in mind that, okay, I want to be Yitzim Achiv also, so then be Yitzim. Says the Gemara, wait a second, Lema, let's say, the Gemara wants to make an interesting diak. Our Mishnah said that the one who's writing Megillah, that we said, Mekivan Liba, because having in mind, we say, give me Yitzim. Now, we just explained that the only way to explain this case is where he's copying from a previously written Megillah. Because they said any other way, you wouldn't be Yaitz Yechiyev because you wouldn't be reading from a full Megillah. So the one who's writing a new Megillah, we said it must be talking about where he's reading from an old Megillah to write his new Megillah. So it says the Gemara, let's say that's Misayel, let's say that supports Rabbi Chana. Why? He says, he says you're not going to write one letter of a Megillah if you're not copying from a previously written one. So you see, seemingly that's supported because the whole case of our Mishnah is only feasible if he's copying from something. Oh, you see, Taka, because that's how it has to be. You have to copy from a Megillah. So well, no. Maybe that's just what happened to be. Maybe you're allowed to write it not copying from something else. The Mishnah is happened to talk about where the guy is copying a Megillah from a previously written one, and the Mishnah has to tell us that, if he's copying from one, if he had in mind that, okay, as I'm doing it, I want to be Yitzim Achiv Megillah, then he's be Yitzim, but not necessarily that you have to do that. Now, the Gemara now goes to discuss this teaching, Gufa. We learned that Amar Rabba Chanan Marich, and he says, he says he's not allowed to write one letter that's not copied from a different script. So on that, the Gemara asks Mesa in the following brayso. Amar Shimon Lasa. He says, Mesa b'da Meir, the story of the Meir, Shalach la'abr shana ba'asya. He went to make the year into a leap year in Asya. And, moreover, there was no Megillah over there. So, by heart, he wrote the whole Megillah, and they read from that Megillah. So, wait a second. Didn't you just tell me you cannot write a scroll if you're not copying from a previously existing one? Here he goes and he writes in heart. He says, no, Shani Meir is different. Because the Mekayim Bey, by him it's fulfilled the pasuk in Mishlei, Va'afa Pecha, and your pupils, Yashida Negdecha will look straight, direct. Which, as the Gemara explains, Amalei Rami Bachama, but Yirmi Medifni says, Mai Va'afa Pecha Yashida Negdecha. What does this pasuk mean? Amalei says to him, it will return. This refers to the words of Torah. Where do you see in this pasuk the words of Torah? Because of Sibu, it says regarding Torah in the pasuk in Mishlei, it says, Hasoyif Enecha B'Benenu, If you just blink your eyes, and it's going to be forgotten from you like in the blink of the eye, it's not going to be there anymore. So the word hasoif is blinking, and it's not there anymore. So va'afapecha is referring to the words of Torah, that va'afalach, and even so, although it's something that if you blink, it's gone. So that's what va'afapecha is alluding to. Hasoif and nechaboy beneno. But they're shiur and shiur negdecha. They're still for Remeir. They're almost like straight directly in front, like as if he had no problem remembering this by heart. So although generally if a person blinks, it's gone. Remeir, he had no problem. It's afapecha. Even if he blinks, the shiur negdecha, it's straight in front of him. So yeah, he could write it by heart. But regularly, a person cannot write it by heart. Now the Gemara asks, but Rav Chizda ashkechel Rav Chanana. Rav Chizda encountered Rav Chanana. He was writing svarim, not from a previously written scroll. And normally he said to him, look, really, it's fit for the whole Torah to be written on by your word. But the sages said, also you're not allowed to write one letter not from the writing. Now says the Gemara, from the fact that he told him that it's fit for the whole Torah to be written based on your mouth. Obviously that Rav Chananel is someone that it's like the words of Torah are like he has a photographic memory, like it's like right there in front of him. And even so, he told him you're not allowed to do this. I bought Rameir because Rameir wrote. So what's the difference between Rameir and Rav Chananel? Says Gemara, no, you're right. Even if someone is Yashid Negdecha, even if someone like literally has a photographic memory and he's able to he doesn't, but you still have to write it Meneksab. But Shasad Chag Shani, a pressing situation is different. Where Rameir went, there was no Megillah. So when there's no Megillah, and he's also someone that Yashid Negdecha, he has a photographic memory, such a person could go ahead and write a Megillah, Shalom Eksab. But in general, you cannot write even one letter, even if you have a photographic memory, you cannot write a Shalom Eksab, but a Shasat Chak is different. So the Gemara says Abaya, and the Gemara writes an exception to this halacha. Abaya shadla debei bar chava. Abaya permitted to the household of bar chava. Bar chava they were meichri tefillin. As the Gemara says above Mitzvah of Chavtes and Beis, that the tefillin of the household of bar chava was very common. They were very popular scribes, a family of scribes. He permitted them to michtav tefillin mezuzahs. They could write tefillin mezuzahs. Shalem like sab. They don't have to be copying over from a different tefillin or mezuzah. Their tefillin mezuzahs. Says the Gemara, come on, who's that like? Says the Gemara, Kaitan like the following time. Kaitan learned the Brayser, Rabbi Yirmiyah B'Shem Rabbeinu, in the name of our teacher. Tefillin the mezuzahs nechtav v'shalem like sab. Tefillin mezuzahs can be written not from a pre-existing writing. And also another halacha, they don't need to have where you carve in the lines in the parchment. The halacha said halacha is halacha Moshe B'Sinai. That actually tefillin ain't shich and sirta. Tefillin do not have to have the carving of the lines, but mezuzahs shich and sirta. Actually, mezuzahs do need to have the carving of the lines. And both of them can be written not from a pre-existing writing. So the Gemara says, "My time, what's the reason why tefillin mezuzah is different than all of the svarim that you can write a shalom leiksav?" Says the Gemara, because migras gedisim, because the words of Kriya Shema, which are in the tefillin and mezuzahs, are very fluid by everyone. And that's not something we're concerned that the person might make a mistake, and therefore you don't have to do it from a pre-existing writing. Mishnah said, this is the end of the Mishnah, that if the Megillah was written with Sam, B'chul, etc., so we said we're going to explain the Gemara, all these different types of dyes and all these different types of parchments that are not valid until it's exactly what we said it has to be. So the Gemara explains what these stuff are. Sam, that we said is not valid, is Sama, is orpiment. That's not an appropriate ink. Sikra, this is Sikros Shema, which Rashi says is a red dye that they would dye shutters with. That's also not a valid dye. Kaimais is kaima, which is the sap of a tree. That's also not valid. So you continue to have your testament alf. Kankantam, which we also said in the Mishnah is not valid, is charta de ushkafi, is it's the dye that the shoemakers make the shoes black. Taisus says, Taisus disagrees with Rashi exactly what it is, but it's this thing that the shoemakers make black. That's not valid. Okay, what were the invalid papers? So he said diftida is not valid. What is diftida? It's the malichul kamir. It's the way you make parchment is you go through a certain process. So they did the salting of it. They did that the flour is added with water onto the parchment, but they didn't go ahead and work it through with gallnuts. So that's not valid. Also, in the yard that we said paper, we said it's not valid. Is machka, it's papyrus, which is a certain type of grass they would make by connecting it together. Those are also not valid. So we said those inks are not valid and those papers are not valid. Mishnah said until it's written Ashudis, which is the Hebrew lettering. So still like it says in the pasuk, Kiksam Mukizman has to be like their writing in their times, which has to be the Hebrew lettering. And we said Allah Seifu Ubidyoy Bechul has to be on parchment. That's the type of thing you can write on. And what type of ink is Diyoy? Says Imam Manon, where do we know this from? Because Asik Sibik Sibu, we're learning Xer Sheva. Ksevach, it says over here in the Megillah with Tifta Estamalka, and Estamalka wrote, so it says the word Ksiva. Ksiva also says over there in Sevi Yirmi Yirmi Baruch, and Baruch said to them, Mepiv Yikra Alai, from his mouth he called to me, it's called Ram Elah, he told me all these words, Vani Kaisiv, and I wrote, so it says the word Ksiva, Al HaSeifer Ubidyoy, on the parchment with ink, and that's how we know that the Megillah has written Ashudis, Al HaSeifer, and with Yoy. Thank you for any time.